So, if you were to print out literally every single email, every Teams chat, every SharePoint document an organization makes in just 1 week,
Oh man, it would be a mountain.
right? Like you wouldn't just fill a standard office filing cabinet. You'd probably fill an entire football stadium with paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the terrifying part for anyone responsible for securing a corporate network is knowing that buried somewhere in that massive stadium is like a single piece of paper with a plain text list of customer credit card numbers.
Or, an unannounced merger document.
Exactly. Or a spreadsheet with the private medical records of your employees. And if you
Wow.
don't have a sophisticated system to map and control that whole stadium full of paper, it's a catastrophic liability. You aren't managed data at that point.
No, you're just waiting for a breeze to blow your secrets right out the front door.
Exactly.
Because it's just a staggering amount of information. And the pace of data creation, it's only accelerating. You just can't rely on users to perfectly organize everything manually. You need an automated, intelligent framework that actually understands what the data is, where it lives, and who should even be allowed to look at it.
Well, welcome to the admin study room. I'm Alex, and I am super thrilled to be jumping into this really important study session with you.
And I'm Jamie. It's fantastic to be here to meticulously unpack all this architecture with you today.
So for today's study session, we are focusing squarely on episode 3 of our journey through the AB-900 exam material.
Right, the Microsoft 365 Certified Copilot and Agent Administration Fundamentals exam.
Exactly. And specifically, today is entirely dedicated to Microsoft Purview Foundations. We're going to explore exactly how organizations manage, protect, and, govern their data using Microsoft Purview.
Because our core mission here is that by the end of this session, you'll be able to confidently recognize these compliance tools, understand the technical mechanisms driving them.
And know exactly which real-world scenarios actually demand their use.
Exactly. And the overarching theme here, especially for the AB-900, is that you just cannot properly or safely deploy an artificial intelligence like Copilot if your underlying data estate is like a chaotic, unsecured mess. We really have to secure the foundation first.
This is an independent, unofficial AB-900 study podcast for Microsoft 365 certified Copilot and Agent Administration Fundamentals. It is based on Microsoft's public Learn content and is run by AI hosts. It is not affiliated with, authorized, sponsored, or approved by Microsoft.
So to start us off on the right technical footing, before we even dream of looking at the specific compliance policies inside of Purview, we really need a flawless map of the big picture.
Yeah, because if you're stepping into a Microsoft 365 administrative role, you're basically confronted with this sprawling ecosystem of different dashboards,
Yeah.
admin centers, portals. It's a lot.
It is. You need to know exactly where Purview lives within that ecosystem, and crucially, where its boundaries end and another admin center begins.
Right. Let's draw those boundaries for you right now, because there isn't just one giant make the network secure dashboard. Microsoft has delineated specific admin centers for specific jobs.
Right.
You have the main Microsoft 365 admin center, the Entra admin center, the Defender portal, and the Purview portal. And honestly, when you're first studying for this exam, it is remarkably easy to mix these up.
Oh, it's probably the most common point of initial confusion, especially trying to distinguish between Defender and Purview. So let's break them down. The Microsoft 365 Admin Center is your foundational tenant and user administration hub.
Like the engine room.
Exactly, the day-to-day engine room. That's where you go to assign a new Copilot license to a user or create a shared mailbox for the marketing team. It handles the structural administration of the tenant itself.
Got it. And then moving laterally, you have the Entra admin center. Whenever you see the word Entra on the exam or out in the field, your brain just needs to immediately default to 2 words: identity and access.
Yes, identity and access.
Entra does not care about what is actually written inside a Word document. It cares about who is attempting to log into the network. It's handling the password hashes, the multi-factor authentication prompts, the conditional access policies.
Right. Entra is constantly evaluating signals, like what's your IP address? Is your device healthy? Are you actually the identity you claim to be? And does corporate policy allow you inside the perimeter right now?
Okay, so if the answer to that question is no, but someone malicious still manages to penetrate the perimeter.
Or they try to brute force their way in.
Right. That is where the Microsoft Defender portal steps up. Defender is totally focused on active security incidents, threats, malware, phishing campaigns, all those security alerts.
Yeah, it uses heuristics and XDR, which is extended detection and response, to hunt for weird network behavior. Defender is basically the heavily armed security guard actively patrolling the perimeter.
Which finally brings us to the absolute star of today's review session, which is Microsoft Purview.
Yes, Purview.
Purview is the primary compliance and data governance portal. Like we said, it doesn't process your password, it's not hunting for ransomware. Purview cares almost exclusively about the data itself.
Right. It's engineered to protect the content, ensure the content complies with global regulations, and govern exactly how long that content is allowed to exist before it becomes, like, a legal liability.
Let's anchor this in a real scenario to make it concrete. Imagine an employee falls victim to a really sophisticated spear phishing attack and their password gets stolen.
Okay, bad day for them.
Very bad day. So where does the incident response team go? Well, they immediately navigate to Entra to revoke the user's active sessions, force a password reset, check the log.
And simultaneously, they'd pivot over to Defender to quarantine that original phishing email and scan the endpoint for malware.
Exactly. But consider a completely different scenario. You've got an employee who is perfectly authenticated, they passed MFA, they're on a healthy corporate laptop, zero malware.
Everything looks fine on the surface.
Right, but that perfectly authenticated employee is trying to attach a highly confidential quarterly earnings report to an email addressed to a personal Gmail account. Or, like, to a journalist.
Ah, yeah. Neither Entra nor Defender is going to stop that because from an identity and threat perspective, everything's working perfectly normally.
Right, the system's like, yeah, that's Steve, he's allowed here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is a pure data governance issue. The admin uses Purview to intercept that. I actually like to visualize the organization's digital footprint as a massive corporate office building.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Yeah, so the Entra Admin Center operates as the badge scanner at the front door. It verifies your corporate identity before the glass turnstile ever even opens.
Okay, and extending that metaphor, the Defender portal is the physical security team. They're the ones watching the CCTV cameras, tackling intruders in the lobby, sweeping for listening devices. They handle the active threats.
Precisely. And that leaves Purview. Purview is the incredibly meticulous, legally trained records manager working deep down in the basement archives.
Oh, I love that.
Purview isn't at the front door checking badges, right? It's not fighting intruders. Its whole existence is dedicated to making sure the reinforced filing covenants are locked, the sensitive files are stamped confidential, and the shredding schedule is executed perfectly.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If I lock down the front door perfectly with Entra and I have Defender stopping all the malware, why do I even need to pay the records manager in the basement? Isn't the data inherently secure if the perimeter is secure?
That is a phenomenal question. And it really strikes at the heart of modern zero-trust architecture. The assumption that perimeter security equals data security is just a fatal flaw.
Really? How so?
Well, first, compromised identities happen. An attacker might bypass Entra, and if they get in and your data isn't governed by Purview, they basically have the keys to the entire kingdom.
Oh, right, because nothing inside is locked down.
Exactly. Second, insider risk. Your own authenticated, perfectly trusted employees are often the ones who accidentally or maliciously leak data.
Good point.
And third, compliance frameworks. Things like GDPR or HIPAA, they do not care how strong your front door is. They legally mandate that the data itself be governed, retained, and auditable, regardless of your perimeter defenses. You have to protect the content itself, independent of the access controls.
That makes perfect sense. And that distinction, protecting the content versus controlling the access, is a huge concept for you to flag in your notes. Entra controls access to the environment. Purview protects the actual data within it.
Exactly.
Now let's address the elephant in the room here. Why is this Purview study session so utterly critical for the AB-900 exam, which is theoretically supposed to be about Copilot and AI agents?
Because the advent of generative AI completely shatters the old security paradigms.
Yeah.
That's the shift you have to understand. Before Copilot, if an employee wanted to find the CEO's compensation package, they had to actively hunt for it.
Right, guessing SharePoint URLs, digging through folders.
Yeah, spending hours searching. Security through obscurity sometimes inadvertently worked.
But Copilot changes the game completely because it's essentially a hyper-efficient, tireless personal assistant for every single employee.
Exactly. Copilot utilizes the Microsoft Graph and Semantic Index to weave together connections across all your emails, chats, documents, meetings with terrifying speed. So if an organization hasn't implemented robust governance and data labeling via Purview, the AI will dutifully scan the entire tenant, find that unsecured file with the executive salaries, and present a beautifully formatted summary of it to a junior analyst.
just because they typed a casual prompt like, what are some interesting files I have access to?
Yes.
So if your data isn't labeled and restricted by Purview, you aren't just leaving your files in a messy warehouse. You're actively arming every employee with a heat-seeking missile designed to find your most sensitive secrets.
That is the exact mechanism.
Yeah.
Secure the data layer first, so the AI layer inherits that security. Copilot only surfaces what Purview says the employee is strictly authorized to see.
Okay, so to solidify, our map Entra is identity, Defender is threat protection, the M365 Admin Center is tenant operations, and Purview is your dedicated headquarters for compliance and data governance.
Perfect summary. Now that we've successfully navigated into the Purview portal, we basically have to start at absolute zero. Step 1.
Right, because you can't govern data, you can't encrypt it, and you certainly can't hide it from Copilot if you have absolutely no idea what the data is or where it resides.
Finding it is the prerequisite.
Which brings us to the critical distinction between data classification and sensitivity labels. These two concepts are frequently conflated by exam candidates, but they are entirely distinct phases.
They're intimately related, but they're different. Let's unpack part 1, data classification. This isn't some manual process where an intern opens every Word document and reads it.
Thank goodness.
Right. Classification is the highly automated programmatic process of discovering and identifying sensitive information across the entire digital estate, because you might have terabytes of data spread everywhere.
So how does Purview actually find it?
It uses a few sophisticated mechanisms to crawl the data. The foundational ones are sensitive information types, or SITs. These rely on pattern matching and regular expressions, commonly known as regex.
Okay, rejects. Like what?
For example, Purview has a built-in regex pattern designed to identify the mathematical structure of a U.S. Social Security number.
Yeah.
You know, a 3-digit number, a dash, a 2-digit number, a dash, and a 4-digit number.
But wait, if it's just using a basic regex pattern, wouldn't that generate massive amounts of false positives? I mean, a standard 9-digit employee ID or a routing number could easily match that format, right?
Absolutely.
And a dashboard full of false positives is virtually useless to an admin.
That is exactly the engineering challenge, and it's why Purview's classification engine is way more than just basic regex. To reduce those false positives, the system requires primary and secondary elements, along with confidence levels.
Oh, interesting. How does that work?
Well, it might see the 9-digit number, that's the primary element, but to achieve a high-confidence classification, it actively scans the proximity of the text surrounding that number. It looks for secondary corroborating evidence.
Like keywords?
Exactly. It'll look for keywords like SSN or Social Security or Tax ID within a 50-character radius of the actual number.
Okay, that proximity scanning is brilliant. But what if we need to identify something utterly unique to our specific company? Like a proprietary list of our own patient IDs, or a database of our specific customer credit cards. A generic pattern won't know which cards belong to our customers.
For that, admins utilize exact data match, or EDM. This is a fascinating mechanism. You basically take a highly structured database, like a CSV file, of your actual customer records. You hash it locally so the raw data is mathematically scrambled and secured, and then upload that hashed schema to Purview.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and then the classification engine can scan the tenant for strings of text that perfectly match the hashes of your actual customer data. It provides incredible precision.
And beyond that, Purview also uses trainable classifiers, right? Which leverage actual machine learning models.
Yes. So instead of writing a rigid regex pattern to find, say, a legal contract, an admin can just feed the machine learning model 500 examples of valid legal contracts and 500 examples of documents that are not contracts.
So the model learns the linguistic nuances, the formatting, the context.
Exactly, allowing it to classify entirely new, unseen documents as contracts based on their structural DNA.
So when you combine regex, exact data match, and trainable classifiers, you essentially deploy an army of highly intelligent digital metal detectors across the organization.
I love the metal detector analogy. That's exactly what it is.
They just relentlessly scan the environment, and administrators can go to Purview's Data Explorer dashboard to view the results. An admin might look at the telemetry and realize, wow, we have an exposed SharePoint site utilized by the marketing department that currently houses over 4,000 documents containing unencrypted European passport numbers.
That is the discovery phase.
Yeah.
You found the vulnerability, you identified the data, but, and this is a big, but merely finding the data with a metal detector doesn't automatically build a vault around it.
Which brings us to part 2, sensitivity labels.
Right. If classification is the radar screen showing you the incoming blip, a sensitivity label is the actual defensive mechanism. It's a literal configurable tag applied to an item like an email or a file or to a larger container like a team or a SharePoint site.
Let me pause and play devil's advocate here, because this is where the exam really loves to trick people. If the classification engine, the hyper-intelligent metal detector, has already scanned the document, analyzed the proximity operators, and confirmed with high confidence that it contains 50 credit card numbers, isn't that document inherently protected by Purview at that exact moment? Why do I need to introduce a separate label into the equation?
It's a critical distinction. And the answer is no. The document is not protected. Classification, by itself, is purely passive visibility.
It's just a report.
Exactly. It's merely a diagnostic report that informs the admin, here is a list of your vulnerabilities. It takes zero defensive action. A sensitivity label, however, is the active enforcement wrapper. It's the mechanism that actually mutates the file to protect it.
Okay, so let's walk through how an admin actually engineers that wrapper. I go into the Purview portal and I create a new sensitivity label. Let's call it Project Titan Top Secret.
Right. Now, the creation of the label name is just the visual component. The real power lies in the protection settings you configure inside that label. For example, you can configure the Project Titan label to enforce visual markings.
Like a watermark.
Yes. Whenever this label is applied to a document, Purview automatically injects a bold red watermark diagonally across the pages and adds a restrictive footer to the document.
But I mean, a watermark won't stop a malicious actor from emailing the file to a competitor. We need actual cryptographic protection.
Which is why the most powerful feature of a sensitivity label is the ability to enforce encryption. Purview integrates with the Azure Rights Management Service. When the label is applied, the content of the file is cryptographically locked.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the admin configures the label's access control list to specify exactly which identities are permitted to hold the decryption key. You can explicitly state, only identities originating from our corporate Entra tenant are allowed to decrypt this file.
This is where we need to introduce the concept of digital DNA, because when that label and its encryption are applied, they don't just exist in the cloud, they are physically injected into the metadata header of the file itself.
Yes, the label travels with the file.
So let's think about what happens if an authorized user downloads that Project Titan document, saves it to a personal unmanaged USB thumb drive, walks to a public library, and attempts to open it on a machine with no corporate management software. What happens?
The file demands authentication. The native application, like Microsoft Word, reads the metadata header, sees the sensitivity label, and reaches out to the Azure Rights Management Service over the internet to request the decryption key.
And if the user can't provide valid Entra credentials proving they're an authorized employee,
the file remains a useless block of encrypted ciphertext. The protection is fused to the data, regardless of where the data physically travels.
that's incredible. Now, to bridge the gap between discovery and protection, you have to consider how these labels are actually applied. Users can apply them manually, right?
Sure, they can literally click a sensitivity drop-down menu in the ribbon of their Outlook or Word app and select Project Titan. But relying entirely on human compliance is super risky. Humans forget, or they simply don't care.
Which is why we integrate the two concepts. We can leverage the intelligence of data classification to execute auto-labeling policies.
Precisely. An admin can configure an auto-labeling policy that basically dictates, if the classification engine detects the presence of 3 or more customer credit card numbers within any document or email, automatically, without user intervention, apply the highly confidential sensitivity label, inject the watermark, and trigger the encryption.
It creates a completely closed-loop security system.
Mm-hmm.
So, the ironclad rule for you to internalize for the exam. Data classification is your passive visibility and discovery engine. Sensitivity labels are your active cryptographic tags that enforce security settings and travel with the content.
Knowing what data you possess and wrapping it in protective metadata is the necessary foundation. But encryption alone isn't a silver bullet.
Right.
You still have authorized users who have legitimate access to decrypted data. What happens when an authorized user attempts to take that decrypted, highly sensitive data and execute a risky action, like transmitting it outside the corporate boundary?
That exact vulnerability brings us to one of the most heavily tested and critical tools in the Purview arsenal: data loss prevention, universally referred to as DLP.
Yes, DLP.
If you recall our architectural metaphors, If a sensitivity label is the DNA-level encryption locking the briefcase, DLP operates as the highly advanced security checkpoint stationed at every possible exit door of the organization.
That's it perfectly. DLP policies are engineered to actively monitor, detect, and prevent the risky sharing, transfer, or unauthorized use of sensitive information across your entire digital estate. It acts as a relentless, real-time boundary monitor.
It's not just watching the cloud either.
Nope, it watches the endpoints, the web browsers, the email transport pipelines, everything.
Let's dissect a highly specific real-world scenario to understand the mechanics here. Imagine a senior nurse at a large healthcare provider. They have legitimate, highly privileged access to unencrypted patient data. It's 6:00 p.m. on a Friday. They are exhausted, and they decide it would be far more convenient to finish their administrative charting from their home computer over the weekend.
Well, this happens all the time.
Right. So the nurse generates a massive Excel extract containing thousands of plain text patient medical records, attaches it to an Outlook email, and types their personal Gmail address into the recipient field.
Okay, let's look at this. From an Entra identity perspective, perfectly authenticated user. From a Defender threat perspective, no malware in the Excel file. Without data loss prevention, that email traverses the exchange transport pipeline, exits the corporate tenant, and lands in an unsecured Google server.
Which means the healthcare provider just suffered a catastrophic high-pay compliance violation.
Exactly, potentially resulting in millions of dollars in fines, and they might not even realize it happened until an audit months later.
But with a meticulously engineered DLP policy, the entire outcome changes. The Purview system intercepts the action in transit. The exchange transport rules hook into the DLP engine.
And then the engine scans the payload of the email and the attachment. It utilizes the exact same data classification mechanisms we just discussed, SITs, regex, EDM, and identifies that the attachment is saturated with medical record numbers.
And then it evaluates the action. Is this sensitive payload attempting to cross the external tenant boundary?
When it determines the answer is yes, the DLP policy triggers. But what makes DLP so powerful is that it isn't just a silent kill switch. It's highly communicative. The administrator can configure the policy to generate a policy tip directly within the user's interface.
Right. Before the nurse even clicks send, a warning banner materializes directly at the top of their Outlook composition window. It explicitly states, "Warning. This document contains restricted patient health information and violates corporate policy regarding external transmission."
The system fundamentally blocks the email from being routed. Simultaneously, the DLP engine generates a high-severity alert in the Purview portal, logging the exact telemetry of the incident for the compliance officer to review.
Now, Jamie, let me push back with a scenario administrators face constantly. Because in a vacuum, blocking that email sounds perfect. But what if that nurse wasn't sending it to their personal Gmail? What if they were attempting to send that critical medical record to an external, third-party surgical specialist for an emergency, life-saving consultation?
The business need.
Exactly. If DLP rigidly blocks that transmission, patient care is severely degraded, the doctor is furious, and the IT department gets blamed for crippling productivity. How does DLP handle the nuance of real business requirements?
That is the exact friction point every compliance admin deals with, and it's why DLP is designed with extreme flexibility.
Right.
A rigid block is often too draconian. Instead, the admin can configure the DLP policy to allow user overrides coupled with business justification.
Explain the mechanics of that for the listener, because that workflow is frequently tested.
Okay, so in the emergency consult scenario, the DLP policy tip still appears, warning the nurse that the data is sensitive. However, the policy provides an interactive button labeled Override Policy. When the nurse clicks it, they are forced to type a written justification into a dialog box. For example, emergency transmission required for Dr. Smith's surgical consult. Once logged, the system permits the email to send.
So it doesn't just stop everything cold.
Right. The critical factor is that the action, the file, and the written justification are all immediately transmitted to the unified audit log in Purview. The admin allows the business to function, but maintains total visibility and an immutable audit trail to review later.
That capability prevents IT from becoming the department of no while still maintaining governance. Furthermore, because administrators are generally terrified of accidentally crippling business processes with a poorly configured policy, Purview offers a crucial deployment feature: simulation mode.
Oh, simulation mode is an absolute lifesaver. You never, ever deploy a new DLP policy directly into enforce mode.
Never.
Never. If your regex pattern is even slightly flawed, you could accidentally block the entire finance department from sending invoices.
Yikes. So how does simulation mode work?
In simulation mode, the DLP policy runs silently in the background. It analyzes the traffic, evaluates the conditions, and logs what it would have blocked. But it takes absolutely no restrictive action and shows no warnings to the users.
So the admin can monitor the simulation logs for like a week, fine-tune the classification rules to eliminate false positives, and only transition to enforce mode when they are mathematically certain the policy is accurate.
Exactly. And we focused heavily on email, but it's critical to understand that DLP extends all the way down to the physical hardware. Endpoint DLP hooks directly into the Windows operating system at the kernel level.
Wow, at the kernel level.
Yep. You can configure a policy that says if a user opens a file tagged with a highly confidential sensitivity label, explicitly disable their ability to copy text from that document to their clipboard, prevent them from using the print screen key, and aggressively block them from transferring that file to an unapproved USB thumb drive.
It just creates this inescapable perimeter around the data. Now, I want to clarify a fundamental architectural difference, because candidates routinely conflate these two systems on the exam. We spent the last segment discussing sensitivity labels protecting data, and now we are discussing DLP protecting data. What is the precise technical distinction you must commit to memory?
It fundamentally boils down to the concept of state versus action. As we detailed, a sensitivity label alters the file's intrinsic state. It injects metadata into the header and applies persistent encryption that travels with the file globally.
Right, it changes the file itself.
Exactly. DLP, conversely, does not alter the state of the file whatsoever. DLP is an environmental monitor that observes the actions the user attempts to perform with the file, like printing, copying, uploading to Dropbox, or emailing externally.
So, labels are the locked briefcase. DLP is the security guard watching you attempt to throw the briefcase over the fence.
That is the perfect summary.
And there's another highly common point of exam confusion we must immediately deconstruct. We just established that DLP prevents data from leaving the environment today, but a frequent trap is confusing data loss prevention with data lifecycle management, specifically retention.
Yes, listeners often mix these up because they both fall under the broad umbrella of managing data.
It is a classic pitfall. So here is the golden, unshakable rule to anchor in your mind. DLP is entirely focused on preventing unauthorized sharing or exfiltration right now, in this exact microsecond. It analyzes the immediate action.
Retention, which we are transitioning to now, operates on an entirely different axis. Retention is about managing the lifespan of data over a long duration of time.
Which leads us into the complexities of the data lifecycle. Because organizations don't merely generate data, they hoard it.
Oh, they absolutely hoard it.
They accumulate massive, sprawling repositories of outdated, irrelevant information. And retaining data indefinitely isn't just expensive from a storage perspective, it is an incredible legal and security liability.
It's a ticking time bomb. If your organization is ever subjected to a regulatory audit or becomes entangled in civil litigation, any data you possess can be legally subject to discovery. If you've neglected to purge 20 years of irrelevant, informal emails, your corporate legal counsel must pay exorbitant fees to sift through 2 decades of communication.
Not to mention, returning to our AI paradigm, hoarding stale data severely degrades the performance of Copilot.
Oh, absolutely. If an executive asks Copilot to summarize the Project Apollo guidelines and you have 5 conflicting drafts of that document spanning 10 years, the AI might surface outdated, factually incorrect information.
Data hygiene is an absolute prerequisite for AI accuracy. So in Purview, retention is the architectural framework used to systematically keep or delete content based on stringent business or regulatory requirements.
The nomenclature retention occasionally misleads people, because colloquially it implies exclusively keeping things. However, in Microsoft Purview, retention configurations perform 2 equally critical yet opposing functions. They strictly enforce that you keep what you legally must, and they ruthlessly enforce that you delete what you no longer require.
Let's illustrate the mechanics of this with another scenario. Returning to our hospital example, healthcare regulations might legally mandate that the hospital must retain all patient treatment records for exactly 7 years following a procedure.
And if they destroy those records prematurely, they are subject to massive federal fines.
To satisfy that mandate, an admin engineers a retention configuration in Purview. For the initial 7-year window, this acts as a rigid keep directive.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt and ask the logistical question every admin wonders. How does the system physically stop a user from deleting something? If a doctor opens their OneDrive, highlights a vital patient record, and forcefully hits Shift-Delete to bypass the recycle bin, how does Purview prevent the data from being destroyed?
The system employs a brilliant mechanism called the preservation hold library in SharePoint and OneDrive, and the recoverable items folder in Exchange. When the doctor hits Shift-Delete, the file absolutely disappears from their visual interface.
So they think they deleted it.
They believe it is permanently gone. However, behind the scenes, Purview intercepts the deletion command and quietly shunts a cryptographically immutable copy of that exact file into the hidden preservation hold library.
And the user can't see it.
Nope, the end user cannot access it, but the compliance administrator and the eDiscovery team can retrieve it at any time. It operates as an invisible, infallible safety net, ensuring compliance.
This is a phenomenal piece of engineering. So the data is immutably preserved for 7 years. But what happens at the exact microsecond that day 1 of year 8 begins? Because the legal mandate to keep it has expired.
This is where the secondary function, the delete action, executes. To actively minimize their legal liability and optimize their storage footprint, the retention configuration is programmed to automatically purge that specific data. Yes. It bypasses the recycle bins and permanently, irrevocably destroys the file from the Microsoft 365 environment. It requires absolutely zero human intervention. You keep it securely for 7 years, and then you systematically destroy it.
Understanding the conceptual goal is straightforward, but precisely how we apply these rules in Purview is where the exam focuses. We have 2 distinct architectural tools to deploy this logic: retention policies and retention labels.
And understanding the technical distinction between the policy and the label is non-negotiable for the test.
Let's visualize our entire data estate as a colossal physical warehouse. If I deploy a retention policy, is that analogous to the warehouse manager instituting a blanket sweeping rule for an entire section of the building? Like, absolutely every piece of paper inside the marketing department's designated room must be retained for 5 years.
That analogy perfectly captures the architecture. A retention policy is applied broadly at the container level. In Microsoft 365, a container is a massive bucket.
Like a SharePoint site.
Exactly. An entire SharePoint site collection is a container. The aggregate of all Exchange mailboxes belonging to the executive team is a container. When you enforce a retention policy, you cast a wide net. If you assign a policy to a specific Microsoft Teams channel dictating a 3-year retention, every single chat message generated within that channel is indiscriminately subjected to that rule, regardless of whether the message is a critical business decision or just a gif of a cat.
Okay, so the policy is the broad container rule. A retention label, conversely, gives us surgical, item-level precision. Extending the warehouse metaphor, a label is like taking a brightly colored, highly specific sticky note and adhering it to one solitary cardboard box. The note explicitly reads, "Destroy this exact document on January 1st, 2030.
Precisely. A retention label is applied to individual granular items, a single Word document, a specific Excel spreadsheet, or an individual email message. And much like the sensitivity labels we discussed earlier, a retention label binds itself to the item. It travels with the file.
Let's trace the logic of a file moving, because that exact scenario is heavily tested. Imagine I have a document stored in a SharePoint site that is governed by a broad 5-year container retention policy. I also have a specific 3-year retention label physically applied to that document. If a user moves that document out of the SharePoint site and drags it into their personal OneDrive folder, which rule applies?
This tests the core principles of retention. Because the retention label is bound to the specific item, it travels with the document into the OneDrive folder. The 3-year item level label continues to dictate the document's lifecycle.
But what about the 5-year policy from SharePoint?
Because the document physically departed the original SharePoint container, it is no longer subjected to the broader 5-year policy of that container. The container policy stays with the container. The label travels with the payload.
Got it. Furthermore, when conflicts arise, which they inevitably do in complex environments, Purview relies on strict hierarchical rules. Explicit inclusion always supersedes implicit inclusion. A specific label applied by a human or an auto-labeling rule will override a broad blanket policy applied to the container.
Summarizing this segment, retention is the architectural discipline of managing the timeline of your data. You deploy policies to enforce broad, invisible rules across massive containers like mailboxes or sites. You utilize labels to enforce surgical, highly visible rules upon individual files. You systematically keep what compliance demands and ruthlessly purge the rest to neutralize legal liability and optimize your AI tools.
Yeah, we have spent considerable time fortifying the perimeter. We deployed DLP to prevent data from leaking out, and we deployed retention to manage its lifespan. But we need to pivot and confront the most complex vector in cybersecurity, the human element. What about the catastrophic risks posed by the actual authenticated employees operating securely inside the organizational perimeter?
It is notoriously the most difficult dimension of security to manage, both technically and culturally. External threat actors and ransomware syndicates dominate the news cycles, but internal employees frequently present a significantly higher statistical risk.
Because they're already inside the walls.
Right. And that risk manifests in two forms: malicious intent, like corporate espionage or sabotage, and simple, careless negligence. Microsoft Purview engineers two entirely distinct, highly specialized tools to mitigate internal threats: insider risk management and communication compliance.
Let's dissect insider risk management first. This tool is fundamentally engineered to analyze risky user activity patterns. It doesn't primarily care about the specific words inside a document. It meticulously analyzes the behavioral actions an employee executes across the network.
Let's model a classic high-stakes insider threat scenario. You employ a senior architectural engineer who has unparalleled access to proprietary CAD designs. On a Tuesday, this engineer submits their formal resignation to HR, indicating they are departing in 2 weeks to join your most aggressive market competitor.
Okay, stress level rising.
Right. Suddenly, at 2:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning, the telemetry shows this engineer logging into the VPN, navigating to a highly restricted SharePoint repository, initiating a massive download of 50 gigabytes of confidential schematics, and subsequently attempting to rapidly rename hundreds of file extensions on their local hard drives.
That sequence of events is a blaring five-alarm fire. But how does an IT admin actually detect that amidst millions of mundane daily log entries?
That is the genius of insider risk management. It isn't just a static alert. It utilizes advanced machine learning to establish a unique behavioral baseline for every single user. It understands what normal looks like for that specific engineer.
And then it flags the anomalies.
Exactly. Then it correlates desperate signals from across the ecosystem.
Yeah.
It ingests the HR connector signal, the resignation event, combines it with Entra telemetry, the anomalous 2:30 a.m. login, and fuses it with SharePoint audit logs, the massive 50 gigabit exfiltration. It synthesizes these disparate events and generates a high-severity alert indicating a coordinated pattern of data theft.
But this immediately raises an immense, glaring problem, particularly for organizations operating in regions with stringent labor unions or strict data privacy frameworks like the European Union. If I'm an employee and I discover that the IT department is utilizing machine learning to monitor my resignation status, my download volume, and my late-night logins, I immediately assume I'm working in a dystopian surveillance state. How does Microsoft navigate the legality and the ethics of employee privacy?
It is the most critical question regarding this tool. Microsoft engineered insider risk management with a principle of privacy by design. By default, all the analytical data presented to the compliance investigator within the dashboard is heavily pseudonymized.
Pseudonymization. That is a critical vocabulary word for the exam. Let's break down the exact mechanics of what the admin actually sees on their screen.
When the alert triggers for a rogue engineer, the compliance admin does not see a dashboard screaming, "John Smith in engineering is stealing data." Instead, they see a mathematically generated anonymous identifier. The alert reads, "User Delta 849 is currently exhibiting a critical 99th percentile risk pattern involving mass data exfiltration subsequent to an HR resignation event."
That is brilliant. The system mathematically forces the investigator to evaluate the severity of the risk pattern itself, entirely stripped of human bias or identity. The admin investigates the telemetry, not the person.
Precisely. And if the admin analyzes the telemetry and concludes this is not a false positive, this pattern represents a verified imminent threat to corporate intellectual property, what is the subsequent workflow?
The IT admin cannot simply unmask the user on a whim, right?
Exactly. The system enforces strict role-based access control, or RBAC. Usually, unmasking the identity requires a documented dual authorization process, often involving legal counsel or human resources. Only after formal approval is the pseudonym removed, revealing John Smith, allowing the organization to initiate a formal legal or disciplinary intervention. It structurally prevents IT personnel from casually monitoring their colleagues.
So insider risk management is focused on the telemetry of actions, the downloads, the deletions, the transfers. Now let's establish the contrast with the second internal tool, communication compliance. If insider risk analyzes the behavioral actions, communication compliance is engineered to analyze the actual content of the conversations.
Exactly. Communication compliance is designed to review risky, inappropriate, or non-compliant messaging. It actively scans the literal textual content inside Exchange emails, Microsoft Teams chats, Yammer threads, and it can even ingest third-party communication channels like Zoom or Slack if the connectors are configured.
We're hunting for a fundamentally different taxonomy of risk here. We aren't looking for someone downloading CAD files. We're looking for an employee utilizing highly offensive, discriminatory, harassing, or threatening language in a direct peer-to-peer Teams message.
Or consider the massive regulatory implications in a sector like finance or pharmaceuticals. You might have a licensed stockbroker who is transmitting an email containing highly coded language that implies insider trading.
Or making guaranteed financial promises to a client, which is a catastrophic violation of SEC or FINRA regulations.
Yes. Communication compliance utilizes sophisticated natural language processing, or NLP, and machine learning classifiers to detect these specific semantic patterns, harassment, regulatory breaches, or even the unauthorized sharing of sensitive data within the body of a text.
Now, I have to challenge this from an operational perspective. Human communication is incredibly nuanced. We use sarcasm, slang, context. If two developers are joking around in a private Teams chat and one says, if this code doesn't compile, I'm going to kill the server, doesn't a rudimentary text scanner flag that as a violent threat? How do you prevent the compliance team from drowning in thousands of absurd false positives?
The administrative friction of false positives is the primary challenge of communication compliance. To mitigate this, Microsoft's classifiers don't just look for isolated keywords. They analyze the semantic context of the surrounding sentences. Furthermore, when a policy detects potentially violative language, it doesn't automatically fire the employee.
Right, it just flags it.
It flags the specific message and routes it to a designated specialized reviewer. That's almost always a trained HR professional or a dedicated compliance officer. Absolutely not a standard IT admin.
The reviewer analyzes the message within its full conversational context to determine if it was harmless sarcasm or a genuine violation of corporate policy. And I want to tie this back to our Copilot paradigm because the synergy here is incredible. Imagine an employee sitting in Copilot chat, and they type a prompt asking the AI to draft a highly aggressive, subtly threatening email to a vendor.
Or they ask Copilot to summarize a restricted financial document so they can paste it into a Teams chat with an unauthorized external guest.
That is the exact intersection of these tools. Communication compliance provides the necessary guardrails to detect and flag that inappropriate content generation, ensuring the AI isn't weaponized to violate corporate policy.
So let's crystallize this segment because examiners love to present a scenario and ask you to choose between the two. Insider risk management analyzes the behavioral patterns and actions of users, the massive downloads, the rapid file deletions, the anomalous logins, and it structurally protects employee privacy via pseudonymization.
And communication compliance analyzes the actual textual content and semantics of conversations to detect harassment, threats, or regulatory violations.
It is the classic dichotomy, actions versus words. If the exam scenario describes suspicious downloading behavior, it's insider risk. If the scenario describes a user sending abusive text in a chat, it's communication compliance.
We are rounding the final corner of our extensive architectural tour of the Purview portal. We have utilized classification to find the data, labels to encrypt it, DLP to restrict its movement, retention to manage its lifespan, and monitoring tools to analyze internal behavior. To complete the administrative picture, we must discuss how an organization measures its overall success and exactly how it responds when the legal department inevitably declares an emergency.
This final segment encompasses three highly specific operational tools: Compliance Manager, Content Search, and eDiscovery. Let's begin from a macro strategic perspective with Compliance Manager.
I am deeply fascinated by Compliance Manager because let's be brutally honest about the reality of IT administration. Global data privacy laws are incomprehensibly complex.
They're a nightmare to translate into IT settings.
Exactly. If the chief legal officer walks into the IT department and asks, are we technically compliant with the European Union's GDPR framework? Or does our tenant architecture satisfy the requirements of the California Consumer Privacy Act? A standard systems administrator cannot reasonably be expected to interpret a 1,000-page legal statute and intuitively know which specific toggles to flip inside Microsoft 365.
It is an impossible expectation. And that massive translation gap between legal theory and technical reality is the exact problem Compliance Manager is engineered to solve. It systematically tracks your organization's technical configuration posture against specific, real-world regulatory frameworks and international standards.
So it's basically a translator.
Exactly. It operates as an incredibly advanced translation engine, converting dense legal requirements into actionable step-by-step technical execution lists.
Think of it conceptually as a highly detailed credit score for your organization's data governance. When you navigate to the Compliance Manager dashboard, you are presented with a literal numerical score. Perhaps your tenant is currently sitting at 64%, but beneath that aggregate score, you don't see confusing legal jargon. You see highly specific, prioritized improvement actions.
It provides absolute clarity. It'll explicitly instruct the admin, to improve your alignment with the HEPA framework by 12 points, you must immediately enforce multi-factor authentication for all accounts possessing global administrative privileges. Or, you must engineer and deploy a data loss prevention policy specifically targeting medical record numbers.
And here is the brilliant part. As the administrator physically executes those technical tasks within the portal, Purview continuously scans the tenant configuration. It verifies that the task was completed, and your compliance score dynamically increases.
It provides the IT department with mathematically measurable proof that they are actively hardening the environment. It entirely eliminates the guesswork from regulatory compliance.
Compliance Manager is your proactive, strategic planner. It prepares the battlefield. But all the preparation in the world doesn't prevent a crisis. What is the operational protocol when a catastrophic event actually occurs? Let's say your corporation is suddenly served with a massive civil lawsuit regarding intellectual property theft, or there's an urgent, highly sensitive internal HR investigation. The legal counsel mandates that you must locate every piece of data related to the incident, and they need it within 24 hours.
This is where the proactive strategy ends, and you must deploy the reactive search and discovery mechanisms within Purview. The foundational entry-level tool for this is content search.
Content search operates exactly as the nomenclature implies, right?
It does. It is the fundamental workhorse utility designed to query and locate content across the vast expanse of the Microsoft 365 tenant. An administrator can execute a unified search spanning thousands of Exchange mailboxes, massive SharePoint site collections, individual OneDrive accounts, and exhaustive Microsoft Teams chat histories simultaneously.
To execute a complex search, administrators utilize KQL, or keyword query language. It's not just typing a word into a box. You use sophisticated Boolean operators, proximity searches, and wildcards. If you simply need to ascertain roughly how many times the confidential codename Project Apollo was transmitted via email within the last 30 days to gauge the scope of a leak, you execute a content search.
It is an incredibly powerful, high-speed, tenant-wide search engine. However, and this is an absolutely critical architectural limitation you must understand for the exam, content search is merely a search utility. It executes the query and returns the results quickly, but it completely lacks the formal, rigorous, legally defensible framework required for actual litigation.
So you can't just use it for a lawsuit.
When a formal lawsuit commences, relying solely on content search is professional malpractice. You must escalate to eDiscovery.
eDiscovery is the formal, heavily structured toolset engineered to find, hold, analyze, and securely export content, specifically for compliance audits, civil litigation, or internal forensic investigations. What is the precise mechanical difference between simply running a content search query and initiating a formal eDiscovery case?
The defining technical differentiator is the concept of the legal hold. Let's dissect a high-stakes scenario. Your organization is being sued for breach of contract by a vendor. The opposing legal counsel serves a subpoena demanding the preservation and production of every single email sent or received by your CEO during the calendar year 2024 that contains the vendor's name.
If the IT admin merely executes a content search today, they might locate 500 relevant emails. But what happens if, tomorrow morning, the CEO realizes the severity of the lawsuit, panics, logs into their Outlook client, and permanently shift deletes 200 of the most damaging emails? You've just permanently lost critical legal evidence.
In the legal realm, that is called spoliation of evidence. If a judge determines your organization allowed spoliation to occur, you can instantly lose the lawsuit, face astronomical punitive damages, and individuals can face criminal obstruction charges.
That's a disaster.
Exactly. Therefore, the admin does not merely execute a search. They instantiate a formal eDiscovery case within Purview. Within the boundaries of that specific case, they identify the CEO's Exchange mailbox as a custodial data source, and they immediately apply a legal hold to it.
The mechanics of a legal hold are fascinating. It's essentially freezing time. Once the eDiscovery legal hold is activated on that mailbox, even if the CEO attempts to delete an email, empties their deleted items folder, and purges their recovery bin, the Purview architecture fundamentally intercepts the deletion.
It secretly retains an immutable, mathematically perfect copy of those emails in a hidden, inaccessible partition of the Exchange database. The user's interface reflects the email is gone, but the eDiscovery architecture ensures it is flawlessly preserved for the legal team.
Exactly. eDiscovery envelops the core search engine within a formal, defensible case management structure. You create the case, you assign specific external legal counsel restricted access to review the data within the Purview portal, you apply legal holds to freeze the evidence and prevent spoliation, and finally, you utilize highly secure export capabilities.
Right, you don't just email results to the lawyers. The eDiscovery tool packages the preserved data into legally recognized formats, like encrypted PST files for Exchange data, or EDRM XML files, which maintain the precise chain of custody and metadata required for admissibility in a court of law.
So, the fundamental error to avoid on the exam is assuming content search and eDiscovery are synonymous or interchangeable. They share the underlying search engine, but their scope is vastly different. Content search is your rapid, everyday administrative query tool. eDiscovery is a formal, legally defensible wrapper that provides case isolation, evidence preservation via legal holds, and secure, auditable export protocols.
Let's execute a final, rapid-fire consolidation of this section. Compliance Manager is your proactive strategist. It translates complex legal frameworks into customized technical execution checklists to systematically harden your defensive posture.
And content search and eDiscovery are your reactive response tools. They empower the organization to locate data swiftly and respond with surgical precision and absolute legal rigor when litigation or audits demand the production of evidence.
We have meticulously traversed an incredible expanse of architectural terrain today within the Purview portal. We initiated the session by defining the boundaries of the administrative ecosystem, strictly separating Purview's dedicated data governance role from Entra's identity management and Defender's active threat neutralization.
We thoroughly explored the mechanics of finding and identifying our vulnerabilities using the regex and machine learning engines of data classification, and we learned how to actively fortify that data by injecting cryptographic metadata via sensitivity labels.
We deployed data loss prevention as the relentless environmental monitor, intercepting actions and guarding the perimeter against the risky transmission of sensitive payloads.
We engineered the long-term temporal lifecycle of our data, balancing stringent regulatory compliance against immense legal liability by deploying broad container retention policies and surgical item-level retention labels.
We inverted our focus to look inward, analyzing complex behavioral telemetry with insider risk management while preserving privacy through pseudonymization. And we deployed natural language processing to monitor inappropriate text via communication compliance.
And finally, we tracked our aggregate defensive posture using the actionable metrics of Compliance Manager and mastered the mechanics of freezing and extracting legal evidence using eDiscovery and legal holds.
It is an undeniably massive, highly complex ecosystem. But when you systematically deconstruct it tool by tool, mechanism by mechanism, you begin to clearly perceive how the architecture intertwines to create a deeply secure, highly compliant, zero-trust environment.
It all fits together, and I want to pause and synthesize one final overarching thought for you to deeply internalize as you continue your exam preparation. We have referenced Copilot throughout the session to ground the concepts, but I want to emphatically stress just how foundational this governance architecture is to the future of technology. As generative AI, Copilot, and autonomous agents become inextricably woven into the fabric of everyday corporate operations, mastering these specific Purview foundations is no longer just a prerequisite for passing the AB-900 exam.
It absolutely is not. It is the fundamental prerequisite for the future of enterprise architecture.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that when a highly advanced AI agent is asked a complex, multivariable question by an employee, the organization's underlying digital environment is already structured so flawlessly and protected so comprehensively that it is technically impossible for the AI to accidentally overshare proprietary data or breach a regulatory compliance framework.
If the sensitivity labels have properly encrypted the metadata and the DLP transport rules are actively monitoring the exits, and the retention policies have ruthlessly purged the decades of stale, conflicting garbage data, the AI transitions from a massive security liability into an incredibly safe, breathtakingly powerful operational asset. The reality is that rigorous data governance is the absolute, unsung hero of the artificial intelligence revolution. You cannot have one without the other.
I couldn't agree more. If you do not meticulously engineer the subterranean foundation, the skyscraper is guaranteed to collapse. This episode is a study aid, not official exam guidance. Always verify important details against the latest Microsoft documentation. Thank you so much for joining us in the admin study room today. Keep dissecting the architecture, keep exploring the boundaries of the portals, and we will see you in the next session.